Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The Delectable Negro by Vincent Woodward with heavy editing by a white liberal queer man. So keep that in mind as we listen. Tonight, we're on part 5, which is actually chapter 4, Domestic Rituals of Consumption. David Walker, who was a major Black abolitionist figure, acknowledged the capacity of slavery to consume Black bodies and souls. In his book, Walker's Appeal, Walker depicts a plantation reality where Black men suffer emasculation. They can neither protect their wives and children, nor can they themselves escape the all-encompassing power of whites, whose malicious hunger, Walker says, gnaws into our very vitals. Walker describes the consumptive process as fundamentally an attack on Black male potency and phallic assertion. They, the whites, know well if we are men, he says. And there is a secret monitor in their hearts which tells them we are. They know. And I say, if we are men and see them treating us in the manner they do, that there can be nothing in our hearts but death alone for them. To Walker's thinking, docile and acquiescing Black men are more easily consumed. He advocates instead the virile, radical Black male. This male, he predicts, will glut and violently overflow the consuming machine. 19th century Black male abolitionists tended to agree with Walker. They felt that only male virility and a strong paternal role could save Black people from social consumption. I noted in chapter 3 how images of human consumption haunted Frederick Douglass. He described slavery as a living entity that wore robes already crimsoned with the blood of millions, and even now feasting itself greedily upon our own flesh. Everywhere Douglass turned, he saw slavery literally, psychically, and psychically consuming Black people. In the battle between Covey and Douglass, we get Douglass's version of Black male might and gladiator-like potency winning out over the white male parasite determined to suck all vitality from the slave. Another Black abolitionist named John S. Jacobs describes slave owners and traders as hungry heirs who partook daily of a feast of blood. Jacob's most painful memories of slavery center upon his emasculated and socially consumed father. He writes, "To be a man and not to be a man, a father without authority, a husband and no protector, is the darkest of fates. Such was the condition of my father, and such is the condition of every slave throughout the United States. He owns nothing. He can claim nothing. His wife is not his. His children are not his. They can be taken from him and sold any minute, as far away from each other as the human fleshmonger may see fit to carry them." White abolitionists documented incidents of Black children literally boiled alive, butchered, and fed to open fires. They debated and deliberated about whether or not America was becoming a cannibal nation. Black men, though, as Jacobs demonstrates, strove to convey the private effects of human consumption by situating these factual and philosophical considerations in the context of their personal demise. Black men demonstrated how the culture of consumption robbed them of their masculinity, destroyed familial units and ties, and portended the literal extinction of the race. Black men had good reason to worry about literal annihilation. Across the nation, whites predicted the extinction and extermination of the Negro. For example, Midwestern economist George M. Weston predicted in 1857 that when the white artisans and farmers want the room which the African occupies, they will take it, not by rude force, but by gentle and gradual processes. I want you to hold that thought because integration is a gentle and gradual process, but it kills the Black man and the Black woman. Sexual and social integration kill the Black man and the Black woman. And over 160 years ago, someone predicted that white people would not take over the Black race by force, but by gentle, gradual, and peaceful processes. The Negro will disappear. Others of the religious persuasion felt that an inherited capacity for Christian persuasion guaranteed the survival of the white race, and the lack of it condemned the Negro race to extinction. Where whites foresaw and depicted clean and innocent processes of natural selection, Black men saw bloodshed and gluttonous consumption. William Wells Browns described a man named Walker, a Negro speculator, who was amassing a fortune by trading in the bones, blood, and nerves of God's children. Solomon Northrop, a free Black man illegally captured and sold into slavery, linked the gastronomical enjoyments of whites and their entitlement to processes of consumption that involved starving, raping, and emasculating slaves. In emphasizing Black male virility and paternity, Black men sought to counter this national death wish toward the Negro, which they experienced as intrinsically tied to their social consumption. So the two were not different. They were tied inextricably to one another. In this chapter, I want to complicate the idea of Black male paternalism and radical insurgence as a final solution to social consumption, because what such an assertion tended to imply was that only radical paternal type men could overcome or escape consumption. Along with radical Black masculinity, Black men emphasized traditional structures of the Black family, reproduction, gender, and sexuality. So Black men hold up those institutions. As an example, the natural counterpart to the virile insurgent Black father was the Black mother, whom most conceived of as the mistress and caretaker of Black civilization. In response to slavery's habit of consuming Black people in body and soul, David Walker advocates the restoration of Black female maternity and reproductive power. The regeneration and sustenance of the race resides in the mothers who bore the pains of death to give us birth, and within the wives whom we love as we do ourselves. While this framing of the Black male's social consumption was a useful uplift strategy, it limited then, as it does today, what we can know about the complex culture of consumption and the myriad of ways Black men resisted and grappled with the reality of their social consumption. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for my gifts. I appreciate you all. The textual focus of this chapter is Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself. The narrative offers many examples of literal, psychic, and erotic consumption, from slaves whose flesh is literally cooked, to others fed alive to machines, to still others starved into sexual submission and erotically consumed by their masters. Jacobs depicts a shocking and haunting tableau of consumption and violence. Like her male contemporaries, Jacobs conceives of institutionalized consumption as a process that erodes familial ties, makes Black men into heathens and brutes, violates Black female chastity, and is antithetical to the Black Uplift Project. For her, the natural antidote to the culture of consumption she graphically depicts is Black male virility, intelligence, and uplift spirit. In the narrative, men such as John Jacobs, who was her brother, Peter, who is a man who helps her escape, and her embattled father fulfill this role. She frequently refers to these men as intelligent, enterprising, and noble hearted. These men form a natural complement to the Black maternal politics informing the narrative. It does not matter that she never successfully couples with a Black man, that her father's loss of his wife contributes to his own death, or that men must suffer torture and death to secure only a few fleeting moments with wives and children. Such tragic losses underscore how slavery isolates loved ones from one another and makes individuals vulnerable through the disruption of the male-female conjugal unions and familial support systems to processes of social consumption. So basically, enslavement ripped away any family ties you had because the process of making a slave was such that you had to see yourself as an individual. That's why in other things that we have read, it talks about how as a Black slave driver, you would beat your mother, your wife, your sister, your aunt, your daughter to uphold this system of slavery because you had been broken by the process of becoming a slave. That's why you would do the horrific things that you would do to your family members because you were all related in some way or another, right? And you had to uphold this system of enslavement because if you didn't, then horrible things would happen to you. So if you didn't do horrific things, horrible things would happen to you. And this is what Woodward is paralleling to a level of social consumption because you had no social connections with your family, even if you slept in the same house, because how do you make peace with somebody that just beat you for not working hard enough? How do you reside and abide in a household with somebody that is beating you and punishing you for not producing enough for this white man? How is it possible to see this Black man that is supposed to be your protector, your provider, your shield as that when he is subject to a white man that is telling him to do these different things? You can't. And you can't build a family with a Black man that sees himself as subject to this white devil. Jacobs structures her uplift politics around stereotypic 19th century dyads of thought and experience, the most central dyad being the Black maternal figure and the insurgent or suffering patriarch. On the one hand, this central male female pairing and its outgrowth, which are male virility, sacrificing maternity, safety and familial union, chastity, and racial continuity, enabled a politics of Black survival. And on the other hand, this rigid male female dynamic prevented access to deeper realities of Black male experience, to Black erotic life, and to a fuller range of Black male survival strategies within a culture of consumption. Someone like Luke, a slave Jacobs depicts as sexually brutalized and socially consumed, has nothing, in Jacob's presentation of him, to do with racial uplift, with an ennobled 19th century Black masculinity, or with Black female politics under slavery. Luke does not fit into the traditional male female dynamic because he does not affect outright resistance. He is subject to his master's homoerotic desires. He registers as sexually ambiguous and undergoes a sustained and ritualized process of social consumption. So Luke was ambiguously gay in the book. And he subjected himself to horrible things under enslavement because he was just trying to survive. According to the prevailing 19th century discourse of manhood, Luke is not a man. And if we go through Jacob's interpretation of his life and circumstances of consumption, we can easily write him off as a casualty of white hunger and appetite. In making Luke one of the focal figures in this chapter, I intend to argue the opposite of Jacob's presumptions. So here he comes to defend his community. I feel that Luke is a different type of representative Black man who, because he does not fit neatly into the prevailing gender and sexual dynamics, offers a non-conforming and complicated understanding of Black male sensibility that we do not get from those Black men who have come to us through history as representative race men. Rather than presuming that he is simply an example of emasculation and Black parasitism, I ask exactly how Luke qualifies as a man and in what ways his gender and sexual variants necessitate a more complicated understanding of Black masculinity in the 19th century. Furthermore, going against the 19th century logic of the Black paternal and maternal pairing, I draw numerous parallels between the lives of Luke and Jacobs. Jacobs also experienced homoerotic abuse at the hands of her mistress and had experiences that did not conform to norms of gender and sex. When we look at Jacobs and Luke relationally, we get a different picture of Black maternity and crucial dimensions of Black female sexuality that we have tended to overlook or misrecognize come into focus. So he's talking about how these queer people during enslavement moved and operated. Now, we saw some of that in Thistlewood and his diaries because they kept getting STDs from one another. So they kept having sex with one another. He kept transmitting diseases to them. There's also a part in the book where he talks about a man sleeping over and spending the night with him, Thistlewood. So what we believe happened is that Thistlewood had homoerotic connections as well. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. In the conclusion of this chapter, I theorize on the largely underdeveloped, under-theorized topics of gender and sexual variance in the context of slavery, drawing mostly on Black feminist scholarship, which has undertaken to correct narratives of Black people as lacking gender and sexual identities under slavery. I challenge us to rethink the theoretical and material potential of transgenderism, gender variance, and sexual fluidity in terms of Black cultural production. These fluid categories of sex and gender, I argue, are crucial to formulating a deeper, more complicated understanding of Black interior life and Black political praxis generated in the 19th century. So again, he's presenting the idea that queer life existed willingly under enslavement. It is my personal perspective that queer life happened under enslavement, but it was a survival mechanism, because if you didn't dress up as a girl when massa wanted you to, you might die. If you didn't go in there and handle Miss Sally as a woman, then because she couldn't get pregnant if she had sex with a woman. And the worst fear in the world for a white woman would be to get pregnant by a slave, because that meant that the child was free. She might be killed, the child might be killed, the man would be killed, or she would be ostracized by society as having this white baby because she had a baby that was born free. So the white womb was sacred to them, right? So she could tell a woman to do things to her physically and make that happen and get her rocks off without fearing pregnancy, because pregnancy for a white woman was the worst possible outcome to her sexual experience with a Black person. And if she had sex with a woman, she did not fear getting pregnant. But anyway, this is the chapter that is in defense of transgenderism and queerness during enslavement. Deciphering Black male rape. On the subject of parallels and pairings, I want to begin my discussion of Luke by drawing our attention to a common and consistently invoked 19th century pairing. I am thinking of the dialectic between the liberated, freedom-seeking Black man and the so-called slave. As noted earlier, David Walker consistently grounds his rhetorical claims to manhood in the dynamic of man versus brutish slave. Speaking to enslaved brethren, he asks, "Are we men?" And then later affirms that we are men and not brutes. Elsewhere in Walker's appeal, he proclaims, "Oh, my colored brethren all over the world, when shall we arise from this death-like apathy and be men?" The natural counterpoint to Walker's appeal to manhood is the slave. Rhetorically speaking, without the slave, there could be no liberated Black man, as they each mutually defined and demarcated the threshold of each other. In terms of consumption, Walker regarded the slave as a natural byproduct of the culture of consumption. Like slabs of meat, slaves are made through acts of butchering and murdering. Their flesh is seasoned and tenderized through cruel acts of self consumption. Walker describes how a son might take his mother, who bore almost the pains of death to give him birth, and by the command of a tyrant, strip her naked as she came into the world and apply the cowhide to her. Such initiatory acts make a man into a slave, according to Walker, and render him vulnerable to the consumptive urges of whites who gorge and satiate themselves upon such twisted acts of violence. Walker's conception of man versus slave reflected general abolitionist thought. A popular abolitionist image conveys this dialectic. The widely used anti slavery emblem was a manacled slave kneeling in supplication. The caption to this image read, "Am I not a man and brother?" How could a man be both manly and a slave, argued abolitionists who believed that slavery unmanned and systematically consumed Black men. Black activist Maria W. Stewart, speaking before a group of Black Bostonians in 1831, admonished, "O ye fearful ones, throw off your fearfulness. If you are men, convince whites that you possess the spirit of men." To Stewart's thinking, real Black men overcame their fears and were assertive in the world, acting as brave sons of Africa, able to draw upon their noble heritage. Whereas Africa signified under slavery hedonism and the loss of cultural legacy, manhood makes possible the transformation of even Africa into a noble and enlivening landscape. The general tide in abolitionist rhetoric was toward manhood and away from a deeper, more complicated meaning for the slave. For example, in his bold assertions of Black manhood, Walker countered Thomas Jefferson's ideas of the Black slave as a heathen, akin to the orangutan, and in reason much inferior to the white man. Walker does not complicate the reality of slave experience by exploring how a man could be a man and also be sexually violated and lacking in paternal authority, or, for that matter, a slave and also a noble and reasoning human being. Instead, he relies upon a dichotomy wherein manhood transcends all of the negative, unseemly connotations of enslavement. In consistently positioning manhood over slave status, Black abolitionists tended to reinforce a false dichotomy in which manhood always represented the good and discerning path toward freedom. The condition of the slave, on the other hand, embodied the most depraved and unspeakable aspects of the Black experience. Greetings, Redo 9002. I'm so glad you're here. The forecast says a lot of times white girls were fined and sent to jail or kicked out of the colony if they had a pickaninny baby, or as they called babies, a little sucker, referring back to what the white woman's fear was in regards to having sexual encounters with Black men versus forcing Black women to take on that role. So are these acts of lesbianism and homosexuality actually a part of our culture? Or are these things that were also epigenetically ingrained in us based on our enslavement and the appetites of white people and their erotic consumption of us? Douglas gives us an example of these unspeakable dimensions of the slave's experience in his first slave narrative. After witnessing the brutal beating of his Aunt Hester, Douglas lets on that this is not the worst of what he will see or what he will be forced to participate in. He has not words, he says, to describe the sensations and awareness that accompanies his brutal initiation. It was the first of a long series of such outrages of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was with the most awful spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld. Douglas never describes this scenario, which recurs in his later narratives in graphic detail, nor do we ever glean from Douglas's other published writings deeper insight into the secret, unspeakable world to which he refers. In chapter 3, I demonstrated how the legacy and ontology of the slave carries over, continues beyond the temporal freeing of the slave. I contend that it is the slave in Douglas who is essential to understanding the limitations, horizons, and potentials of the free and emancipated man. I reference this distinction between man and slave because it is crucial to understanding why Jacobs chose to narrate Luke's story of explicit male sexual violation in the first place. Jacob's narrative is, at least on the surface, a story about Black female violation and recuperative powers of motherhood. In the preface to the slave narrative, Jacobs makes clear that she writes on behalf of the condition of 2 million women at the South, still in bondage, suffering what I suffered, and most of them far worse. Black male sexual violation did not figure into Jacobs' gender and politics, which might explain why scholars have had very little to say about Luke or why Jacobs chose to tell his story. For the most part, scholars of Jacobs' narrative have either ignored the subject of male rape or misrecognized it. P. Gabriel Foreman refers to Luke as a rare example of homosexual abuse to which male narrators rarely, if ever, admit, but he does not himself analyze the importance and significance of Luke to the larger narrative. Anne Bradford Warner cites Luke as a terse example of slave vernacular, making no reference to his sexual treatment. Jean Fagan Yellen, the preeminent Jacobs biographer, painstakingly tracks down all manner of minute detail and historical fact from Jacob's narrative, but leaves untouched the subject of male rape and the broader implications of homoeroticism on the plantation. Maurice Wallace offers the most insightful understanding of Luke and sodomy belief in the time period. Luke's master suffers, according to Jacobs, from excessive dissipation. Wallace traces this malady to the medical science and period of the period. Excessive dissipation and palsy were the consequences of sexual perversions, including masturbation and sodomy, for which the usual prognosis was progressive dementia. Using the terminology of the time period, Wallace helps us understand how Jacob's reading of Luke's master as demented and sexually strange coincided with medical notions of sodomy as an illness of the body and mind. So as you can see, this idea that homosexuality didn't happen on the plantation is total nonsense. They had medical terms for it. And they pathologized everything and they put everything down. They documented what they did. They documented their crimes. They highlighted the different types of behaviors that they would demonstrate on the plantation. What Luke meant, though, as an outgrowth of his master's sexual illness, has to do with the politics of why Jacobs chose to tell us his story. 2 centuries earlier, a New Netherland court executed Jan Creole for committing sodomy upon the body of Manuel Congo. The court fined both Creole and Congo as sodomites, Black sodomites. The reason their stories were told had to do with the preservation of Christian morals and values. Both Blacks were condemned of God as an abomination. Elsewhere in the colonies, separate sodomy legislation for Blacks would affirm how, in the minds of whites, the Black sodomite was a natural outgrowth of African hedonism and an innate immorality. We cannot separate a sexual interpretation of Creole, Congo, or Luke from larger institutionalized conceptions of the Negro as sexually licentious and amoral. The reasons Jacobs chose to tell Luke's story would have differed greatly from the political aims of the Christian state. Yet I use this state example to demonstrate how moral, political, and state-making ideology informed the depiction of Black sodomites or raped Black men in the colonial United States. Questions of intentionality direct us to the political utility behind colonial-era depictions of Black male homoeroticism. So they killed both Black men for practicing sodomy, not even coming up with the idea or rationale as to why they would have been practicing sodomy. Was it a preference or was this something they were compelled to do? Greetings, MG2. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Jacob's motive in telling Luke's story takes on even greater import when we recall that Black people on the whole did not write about male rape or homoeroticism. Of the hundreds of thousands of pages of narrative, testimony, recorded speeches, and liberationist tracts written by Black men, we have yet to recover overt depictions of male rape or homoeroticism. For Black women, such a topic was even more taboo, as it suggested sexual licentiousness and a knowledge of sexual matters that most women disavowed. Jacobs knew these rhetorical sexual politics as well. A master of rhetorical strategies, she single-handedly revised the conventions of the slave narrative, the sentimental novel, and the uplift tract to construct a unique and singular document about Black female liberation and womanhood under slavery. For such a woman, the telling of Luke's story had profound political import that we can access only partially through sexual interpretations of his master and his treatment under his master. Thinking about Jacobs' intentionality in terms of the man-slave dialectic, Jacobs can entertain certain elements of Luke's sexual abuse and personal history because he never, within the scheme of her narrative, enters into or threatens the sacred precincts of manhood. Most of the scholarship on Jacob's narrative focuses quite appropriately on the centrality of motherhood and on Jacob's frequent appeals throughout the narrative to the cult of true womanhood. Alongside her claims to femininity and motherhood, though, Jacobs intended her narrative to document the parallel plight of Black men, which she understood to complement her model of the Black woman as nurturer and sustainer of the race. For example, in the chapter titled The Slave Who Dared to Feel Like a Man, she documents at length the parallel struggles of her brother Benjamin to sustain an embattled sense of manhood. Luke's story, on the other hand, takes up approximately 2.5 pages of the narrative and focuses on his sexualized treatment, his folk-like ignorance, and his lack of moral perspective. Where Benjamin complements and provides a parallel to his sister's story, Luke represents the extent to which the chattel institution can unman an individual. In terms of the man-slave dynamic, we might think of Luke, according to Jacob's logic, as the perfect embodiment of the slave. Of all the male slaves depicted in the narrative, Luke's sexual violation marks him as the most depraved, the most degraded, and the most apt object of the male unspeakable. Long before we get to Luke, a poor, ignorant, depraved specimen of manhood, Jacob drops hints and suggestions that dictate how we are to read and interpret Luke's lack of manhood. The first of these hints comes in chapter 8 of the narrative titled, What Slaves Are Taught to Think of the North. Jacobs begins by commenting on the deceptive tricks of masters. One master describes to his slaves the horrible and impoverished circumstances of a free life. A slaveholder once told me, Jacob recites, that he had seen a runaway friend of mine in New York and that she besought him to take her back to her master, for she was literally dying of starvation, that many days she had only one cold potato to eat, and at other times could get nothing at all. So in her narrative, Jacobs highlights many times how slave owners lied to enslaved people to prevent them from running away, because they could not hold these people in body physically if they all decided to just run away, but they could hold them mentally, and those mental shackles, remnants of them, are still with us to this very day. According to Jacobs, many of the general mass of slaves believe such lies, which results not only in their physical bondage, but also the enslavement of their minds and sensibilities. Black men, under such circumstances, do not understand that freedom could make them useful men, nor do they understand, according to Jacobs, how freedom could enable them to protect their wives and children. Subtly, Jacobs argues against the belief that the Negro was innately heathen. She admits that the Black man in slavery is a heathen, but blames this state on the absence of proper Christian training, the denial of the paternal role, and the inherently heathen nature of the institution of slavery. Jacobs navigates a fine line between the innately African heathen and her New World African American heathen, who is, unlike his ancestors, a victim of his circumstances. The slave is heathen either by ancestry or circumstances, and the black man walks free of ideological as well as literal shackles. Heathen black men, or slaves, by definition, could not protect their wives and children. They were sneaky, ignorant, and susceptible to the mental suggestions of their masters. Some poor creatures have been so brutalized by the lash, they will sneak out of the way to give their masters free access to their wives and daughters. Do you think this proves the black man to belong to an inferior order of being? Jacobs responds to her own question a couple of lines later by saying, I admit the black man is inferior. In contrast to the inferiority of the slave, Jacobs first chooses for herself a free black man whom she desires to marry. Her master does not allow this union, so she later chooses an erotic relationship with a white man who does not own slaves. Compared to these chivalric models of manhood, Jacobs finds enslaved men an inferior order of beings. Those were her words. These men who had been taken from their home generations ago, who had been beaten and broken into submission, many of whom were bred at breeding farms, so they had no knowledge of themselves, no understanding of what it was to be a man. They only were beasts of burden. They knew that they must work or else they would die. And she saw them as an inferior order of beings because somewhere within her, a gleam of freedom of what it was like to be a woman with choice, actualized feeling and knowing of herself still existed within her. And that's why she ran away to freedom. Not only can Luke not protect a hypothetical wife or child from his abuse, he cannot protect himself from the sexual licentiousness of his master. Luke's unnamed master chains the black man to his bed, having fallen prey to the vices growing out of the patriarchal institution. Luke's master perpetuates the strangest freaks of despotism. Jacobs leaves it to her reader to imagine the details of these sexual acts, but does make clear in her references to the patriarchal institution and the master's degraded wreck of manhood, how thoroughly unmanned is Luke in the process of his enslavement. She uses the term patriarchal institution elsewhere in the narrative to refer to masters who sexually violate black women on the plantation. Luke's master treats him like a black woman. Jacobs does not go so far, however, as to label Luke as feminine or womanly. Her politics of black womanhood do not allow for feminine or womanly men. Instead, she references his feminine nature through allusions to the master's sexual dominance and implicit comparison with other black men who presumably avoid Luke's fate. For example, Jacobs describes Peter, the black man who assists her in her final escape, as a brave, enterprising, noble-hearted man who was a chattel. Technically speaking, Peter is a slave like Luke. However, the however, the author casts Luke as poor, ignorant, and much abused, even after she encounters him following his escape in the north. Within Jacob's paradigm of masculinity, Black men fall into one of two categories: man or slave. In the above mentioned chapter titled The Slave Who Dared to Feel Like a Man, she focuses on the evolution of her brother Benjamin from slave to man. The culminating moment of Benjamin's manhood is the prototypical physical battle between slave and master. One day, the master tries to whip Benjamin. He resisted. Master and slave fought, and finally the master was thrown. Benjamin had cause to tremble, for he had thrown to the ground his master, one of the richest men in town. In pursuit of his manhood, Benjamin flees the plantation. His master captures him. He escapes again, and finally he achieves permanent free status in the North. Physical combat, literal escape, and longing for a lost paternal figure typify the journey of the real man that Benjamin represents. Luke, by comparison, does not flee from his abuser, nor does he engage him in warrior-type physical battle. Instead of depicting Luke as brave, enterprising, and intelligent, Jacobs depicts him as defeated and degraded, a slave who dares not to feel or act as a man. Just because Luke is sexually violated, though, does not mean that he is not brave, enterprising, or intelligent. His escape from slavery indicates on some level he maintained a reserve of bravery and enterprise that allowed him to outsmart local paddy rollers and slave catchers. Yet to allow Luke this complexity would necessitate more deeply at the erotic tie between master and slave, and, on Jacob's part, working from the politics of Black womanhood that did not depend upon dichotomies of ennobled man versus emasculated slave. Her presentation of Luke In her presentation of Luke, Jacobs implicitly draws upon plantation codes of Black masculine shame and self-blame. According to James Oliver Horton and Lewis Horton, among the slaves, men who refused to submit to the master's authority were accorded respect. Them as won't fight, reported Lewis Clark, is called poke easy. This unspoken honor code helps explain the sparse historical record regarding male rape. Admission to rape, more than any other act I can think of, would have called into question a Black man's honor. Luke's master had greatly diminished physical strength. He had to call in the constable to administer beatings for him. According to the unspoken Black male code of honor, Luke represented the least respectable model of Black masculinity if he registered as a man at all. In contrast, Black women could undergo rape and still emerge from such circumstances as honorable, contributing members of the race. In the context of racial uplift, both Black men and women bartered in a female violation. For Black men, it represented the greatest measure of their emasculation. And for Black women, such as Jacobs, the reality of rape informed her politics of Black womanhood and motherhood. Trudier Harris offers a useful assessment of the gender politics of rape during and following slavery. Her explanation helps us understand why Luke has no gender identity outside of the ambiguous sexuality of the slave. Though raped, Black women, she contends, were psychologically warped. Their sexual violation does not lead to a subtraction from their persons. The implicit reference here is the castrated or emasculated Black male. She continues. No matter the father of her children, she was still able to fulfill, in spite of the conditions under which the fulfillment was carried out, her traditional role as a woman within society, that of the bearer of children. The Black male, on the other hand, could only envision his worth in intangible ways. So, what she's saying is that when Black males were raped, they didn't have a way to express their manhood or their masculinity. But women, even though they were raped, they were still women because their rape usually resulted not only in the violence against them, but it could produce life. It could produce life, which is a disturbing perspective to have, an interesting way to look at things. But that is how things were looked at. That's how Trudeau views it, that the woman could still produce life as a consequence of her rape, but the man produced nothing as a consequence of his rape. Harris raises several illuminating and useful points. First, she points to an implicit sexual politics within Black uplift ideology. According to these politics, Black people have historically identified Black women with the womb, with reproduction, while they have identified Black men with the penis or phallic agency. After slavery, lynching, and castration came to symbolize Black masculinity and male violation. The raped wife and maternal figure, examples of which proliferate in slave narratives and abolitionist writings, came to signify the defilement of Black womanhood. Luke's sexual violation does not fit neatly into either of these categories. We do not know exactly how his anus and penis were used in the context of sexual abuse. And as far as transcending his sexual violation, his rape does not reap children, the ultimate sign of female accomplishment. The only access to gender and sexuality for Luke and for Black men in general through the Black woman is through the Black woman. If he can have a Black woman, possess her, and protect her, then he is a man. If not, he is devoid of manhood. In Jacob's version of this equation, Black men had neither gender role nor sexual identity outside of their main role of protecting and complementing the Black woman. In this equation, Black male sexual violation is, in and of itself, a zero factor. Black male gender roles mean nothing in relationship to Black or white men. When we speak of the absence of historical examples of male rape, we are implicitly referring to a worldview in which the rape of Black men had no cultural agency, had neither psychic nor political import. And so, in order to tell Luke's story, Jacobs has to work through an alternative constellation of signs and social meanings. Framing Luke as a slave makes his articulation possible. The slave was already understood in the negative as the opposite of all the positive and sustaining characteristics of the heroic Black man. Where the heroic Black man stood apart from the relational and affectional ties that endeared and bound Black men to whites, either through escape or frequent acts of resistance, The male slave was erotically available as caretaker, nursemaid, uncle, and domesticated servant. The correlation between Luke and slave status, I'm suggesting, should inspire us to look anew at the discursive implications of the slave within antebellum Black liberationist discourse. Rather than presuming, as we do, that Black people on the whole adopted Victorian attitudes about sexuality, it might be more correct to assume that Black people maintained complicated understandings of the slave's life and being as intrinsically sexualized. Among his numerous meanings, Luke is an indicator of the realm of sexual experience and discourse that 19th century gender and sexual norms only obscure. Mm. So when you think of other male characters, whether fictionalized or biographical, do you think that there were other Black male homosexual slaves written into the text that perhaps we didn't pick up on? What of Uncle Tom? He was buck broken. He had been through the experience of being raped, probably, because he was complete and totally broken. And even though he ultimately protected and did not give up or hunt her down, do you think that Sambo was broken in that same way? Or did he just have the fear of being broken in that same way? It's an interesting set of questions to ask. The master epicure. We might recover some of the discursive potential of the slave through a deeper exploration of hunger and consumption on the plantation. The cure of consumption constituted the culture of consumption, constituted a complicated terrain wherein the slave affected resistance, often occupied a gender and sexually variant status, and constituted self through violent and coercive homoerotic ties to the master. The category of slave in such contexts was essentially fluid and informed by a larger dynamics of plantation incest, relational ties between Blacks and whites, and most importantly, the white person's cultivated hunger for Black flesh and soul. Before inserting Luke into the context I am describing, let me first explain the centrality of sex and human consumption within Jacob's narrative. Jacob's depicts scenes of consumption more gruesome than those documented by any of her contemporaries. The only woman to come close to horrors that few wanted to confront was Lydia Maria Child. Child penned the introduction to Jacob's narrative and wrote the widely read An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans in 1833. An Appeal was a groundbreaking abolitionist tract that documented the horrors of slavery and depicted Africans as having a cultural legacy and an innate moral character. At the age of 31, Child was hailed as the best known woman writer in America. However, after the publication of An Appeal, most of the Beacon Street homes that once welcomed its author were henceforth closed to her. The Boston Athenaeum canceled her membership. Sales for her book declined, and subscriptions to Juvenile Miscellany dropped off so sharply that the magazine ceased publication in 1834, just 1 year later. Many can come to know Child as a paragon of female virtue and domestic cultivation. Part of the reason for her ostracization stemmed from her graphic and what some considered licentious and unsexed depictions of slavery. One illustrated page in the text features sketches of more common torture devices: the iron cuffs, iron shackles, thumbscrew, and speculum oris, and detailed explanation of how each device functioned. Prefiguring Jacob's depictions of consumption, Childs describes a 10-month-old baby boiled alive on board a slave schooner. In one of the most graphic depictions of plantation violence from the era, Child describes the literal butchering and cooking of a young recalcitrant slave on a Kentucky plantation. Adding insult to the injured, delicate sensibilities of her readers, Child alludes in an appeal to the fortunes of Bostonians made by the sale of Negro blood, advocates for the legalization of marriage between persons of different colors, and argues against Massachusetts' support of the fugitive slave law. So she was really about that life, because she was saying Black people and white people should be able to get married, and these things, including the boiling of children and killing of children, are some of the horrors that are experienced during enslavement. As a result of her own painful social ostracization, and with an eye toward preserving Jacob's female respectability, Child recommended that Jacobs compile all the incidents of flesh consumption and references to human cannibalism in one chapter of the narrative. In the chapter from the slave narrative titled Sketches of Neighboring Slaveholders, Jacobs depicts bodies literally consumed by vermin, literally cooked, or having cooked iron things applied to their flesh. Masters starve their slaves, do not allow them to breastfeed their young, and in other ways introduce bonded persons to the consumptive machinery of slave culture. The idea of slavery itself as a living and consuming thing is difficult to imagine. However, Jacobs brings this reality to life by depicting scenarios of consumption that involve machines, shackles, and mechanical contrivances. As a punishment for trying to escape, one slave was placed between the screws of the cotton gin to stay as long as he had been in the woods. The cotton gin was then screwed down, only allowing him room to turn on his side when he could not lie on his back. The master's placing of the slave literally between the screws of the cotton gin, at the point at which the cotton gin feeds into the machine, makes even more graphic the consumptive relationship between chattel person and machine. What follows, while the man is positioned thusly, emphasizes his master's feeding of him to the machinery of slavery. Jacobs writes, "Every morning a slave was sent with a piece of bread and a bowl of water, which were placed within reach of the poor fellow. 4 days passed, and the slave continued to carry the bread and water. On the second morning, he found the bread gone, but the water untouched. When he had been in the press for 4 days and 5 nights, the slave informed his master that the water had not been used for 4 mornings, and that a horrible stench came from the gin house. The overseer was sent to examine it. When the press was unscrewed, the dead body was found, partly eaten by rats and vermin. Perhaps the rats that devoured his bread had gnawed him before his life was extinct. As I have noted earlier, slaves consistently referred to slavery as a consuming, bloodthirsty institution, and slavers as human butchers and the like. But incidents such as this one applied concrete images and scenario to a reality that we have tended to largely dismiss as metaphoric or a residue of the traumatized slave's imagination. For example, in her slave narrative, The History of Mary Prince, a West Indian slave, written in 1831, Mary Prince makes constant reference to slavery as a process of butchery and to slaves as butchered meat. Describing herself on the auction block, Prince laments, "I was soon surrounded by strange men who examined and handled me in the same manner that a butcher would a calf or a lamb he was about to purchase." Mm. Later in the narrative, she describes her transition from one master to another as going from one butcher to another. And while those who study slavery have been willing to acknowledge the authority of slaves to speak on the subject of what slaves feel about the morality of slavery, we have yet to fully grant this acknowledgement to the disturbing reality and moral implications of slave consumption. MG2 says, "A male who is in fear of buck breaking has already succumbed to the breaking from the fear alone." Mm. In addition to the cotton gin punishment, Jacobs records other systematic processes of consumption. On a neighboring plantation, there lived an extremely wealthy man who owned upward of 600 slaves, many of whom he did not even know by sight. In response to slaves frequently stealing and eating of hogs, this master developed a mode of punishment that entailed the culinary preparation of flesh. Of his many styles of punishment, a favorite one was to tie a rope around a man's body and suspend him from the ground. A fire was kindled over him, from which was suspended a piece of fat pork. As this cooked, the scalding drops of fat continually fell on the bare flesh. Typically, in the kitchen of the plantation big house, a piece of pork fat was served as seasoning in, say, a pot of beans or stew. Within a modern day soul food repertoire, collard greens are still prepared in many kitchens with pork fat or ham hock, a tradition that stems back to slavery. This practice, which makes no sense in our contemporary, largely sedentary and non agrarian society, was a means by which slaves could avail themselves of desperately needed fat and sustenance that they would need to draw upon during a back-breaking day of field labor. Pork meat was typically associated with starvation and hunger under slavery. Hog stealing reached such proportions that in 1748, Virginia decreed the death penalty for a third offense. Aware of the premium placed on pork meat by the starving slave, this master's punishment was doubly cruel. It punished the slave first for simply hungering, and second with the scalding, liquefied flesh that he would otherwise consume as nourishment. Rather than the typical process of fattening up a food source, the inverted man conveys how starvation and hunger induction make the slave ready for consumption. The master demonstrates that the slave is an emotional and physical food source by situating him within an inverted cooking scenario. The master situates the slave below the cooking fire and the scalding grease used to season and temper his flesh. In another less graphic example, Jacob depicts what happens to a man on a plantation caught stealing food. His master chains him to a tree, beats him, and then starves him to the point of visible emaciation. If a slave stole from him, the master, even a pound of meat or a peck of corn, if detection followed, he was put in chains and imprisoned, and so kept till his form was attenuated by hunger and suffering. These larger systemic examples of consumption took on more intimate erotic connotations within the domestic sphere of the plantation, where social death rather than literal death was the preferred outcome. Orlando Patterson's description of the master as a human parasite, feeding his sense of honor and his sexual appetite through the slave is born out in the Jacob's narrative. Jacobs describes her own master, Dr. Flint, as possessed of a restless, craving, vicious nature. Flint habitually roved around day and night seeking whom to devour. In Jacob's life, Flint's hunger takes on a sexual significance that involves his consistently propositioning her for sex, inviting her to be his concubine, writing notes that spell out explicitly his sexual intentions, and physically abusing her when she does not acquiesce, so she could read, which was rare during enslavement. Slave masters sustain the systemic aspects of consumption that I have outlined on emotional and psychic levels through cultivated tastes, socially sanctioned appetites, and high cultural values attributed to the enslaved person's consumption. In Jacob's narrative, this cultivated sensibility and personality takes the form of masters who play the role of epicure. Incidents provides many examples of masters who are epicures of certain punishments, sexual brutality, physical brutalization, and more. Incidents of graphic human consumption were, in Jacob's mind, symptomatic of a broader ideology of flesh tasting and sexual or erotic hungers that the master cultivated in himself. In Flint, this cultivation of flesh hunger and sexual appetite stems back to childhood and the social consumption of the Black mammy. Jacobs describes Flint as an epicure. She means this in the traditional sense of the word, a person who has specialized, cultivated knowledge in the arts, food, or some other specialized area. The context of this statement is Flint's scrutinizing of every single dish that comes out of the main kitchen. In addition to these typical meanings of the word epicure, Jacobs also uses the word to refer to Flint's cultivated knowledge of slave consumption. The cook never sent a dinner to his table without fear and trembling. If a dish was not sufficiently prepared, Flint would have this woman whipped or compel her to eat every mouthful of it in his presence. Literally, Flint would take the food and cram it down her throat till she choked. Gorging and starvation defined the cook's existence, whom Jacobs describes as a poor, hungry creature. The brutality and calculation of Flint's Epicurean punishments know no end. In another incident, the house dog dies after barely consuming a plate of Indian mush prepared by the cook. He refused to eat, and when his head was held over it, the froth flowed from his mouth into the basin. He died a few minutes later. Of course, Flint blames the cook and compels her to eat this mess, which sickens her but satisfies her master. Operating out of a traditional idea of the mammy cook, Flint expects the Black woman to have no needs, no appetites. Not only does she cook food, she is food. She, or it, is the ever smiling source of sustenance for both infants and adults. The cook, or mammy, represents Flint's appetites, tastes, and hungers, which extend beyond the table into the flesh of the maternal urges of the cook herself. Jacobs further elaborates this interlinking of Black maternity with white male appetite through scenes in which the master compels the cook to starve her newborn infant as punishments for her indiscretions. This poor woman endured many cruelties from her master and mistress. Sometimes she was locked up away from her nursing baby for a whole day and night. On the surface, Flint operates as a patriarch and an authoritative figure with the power to chastise and infantilize his female slave. At a deeper level of social meaning, Flint plays the role of a sycophantic child whose hunger and impulses compete with those of the bonded child. Adult whites, such as Flint, grew up within a plantation reality that conditioned them to think of Black women as endless fonts of nursing and sustenance. This expectation, according to Deborah Gray White, originated in the mythology of the mammy, whom whites thought of as the woman who could do anything and do it better than anyone else. Because of her expertise in all domestic matters, she was the premier house servant, and all others were her subordinates. Jacobs recalls whites referring to her grandmother as mammy. White women were generally thought of as ennobled mothers, but mammies, a degraded model of motherhood, had to bear the stigma of enslavement and still compassionately mother white babies before their own. Jacobs's grandmother had to do this, replacing Jacob's mother at her breast with the daughter of the master, whom she nursed until weaned. Keeping the correlation between maternal nurturing and human consumption in mind, I want to now turn to Luke. Luke's master is also an epicure. He acts upon infantile urges, develops a cultivated taste for Negro flesh, practices a type of sexual consumption, and is a parasitic personality. I mentioned Flint's Epicurean appetites in advance of those of Luke's master because Flint, as the model consumer in the narrative, serves as the prototype of the master as epicure. We cannot fully grasp the import of Luke's sexualized treatment apart from this larger context of Flint's hunger for and his process of glutting and starving the Black mother. Neither I intend to show can we fully understand the implications of female maternity, female consumption, or Black female sexuality in Jacob's narrative without considering Luke's paternal-maternal relationship with his master. Within the psychology of white males in the antebellum South, homoerotic desire for Black men and fantasies of maternity coalesced. In the culture of blackface minstrelsy, Eric Lott interprets the female roles performed at the time solely by white men as a cover for Black maleness. Her typically jutting protuberances and general phallic suggestiveness bear all the marks of the white fantasized Black men who loom so large in racialized phallic scenarios. It makes perfect sense that castration anxieties and blackface would conjoin the Black penis and the woman. Another referent for whites of Lacan's threatening mother, Frantz Fanon argued, is precisely the Black male. If anything, if Luke is anything, he is a sign and source of the type of nurturing and constancy that a mother provides. So this is him explaining away Luke's effeminate ways. Luke's master returns to the plantation from the north, completely incapacitated. The white man returns, deprived of the use of his limbs, bedridden, and often so weak he could not perform his daily tortures of Luke. He is like a helpless infant who has to depend upon Luke for his sustenance and well-being. Why didn't Luke kill him? Jacobs observes the fact that he was entirely dependent upon Luke's care and was obliged to be tended like an infant instead of inspiring any gratitude or compassion towards his poor slave, seemed only to increase his irritability and cruelty. As we have seen with Flint and the cook, the satiation of the master's hunger is typically infused with cruelty and sadism, denying the cook's maternal responsibilities, equating her with something animal-like, and making her eat from the dog's dish all serve a singular purpose. These actions serve to feed Flint's twisted infantile understanding of the Black mammy as an endless font of nurturing and sustenance. In Luke, we have another example of the slave nurturing and sustaining the psychic and emotional well-being of the master. For Luke's master, making Luke go about half clothed in a day shirt reinforces childhood memories of plantation life. Luke is often not allowed to wear anything but his shirt in order to be in readiness to be flogged, and a day seldom passed without him receiving more or less blows. Frequency and access increase the master's pleasure and well-being. He finds pleasure and erotic climax in the context of punishment, often whipping Luke till his strength was exhausted. Luke's rear parts serve as erotic spectacle, as he is often made to bend down, bend over, and turn around half naked. Sam Anderson, an ex-slave, tells the WPA interviewer, "In slavery time, we wore shirts. I wore a shirt till I was 10 years old, and these shirts were split up the side, and when we ran, they would sail around behind." Ruling class whites were in the habit of seeing the slaves' bodies exposed under these gowns. If the gowns sailed out behind, there was nothing to inhibit frontal view of genitalia. Duncan McCassell, at the age of 15, had never worn a pair of pants. You had young adults with well-developed bodies running around the plantation, sometimes into their 20s, fully exposed to whites. Perhaps Luke's masters sought to recreate recollections of mature younger slaves dressed as half-clad infants. Perhaps he drew from mental snapshots of same-aged playmates made to go about half-clad. Either way, dressing Luke in just a day shirt evokes a childhood reality of half-dressed slaves. It reinforces Luke's position of child and his master's position of parasitic adult child. So he made Luke specifically walk around only in a shirt so that he could have easy access to him. But can you imagine what they were doing to these children? Because we know that they're pedophiles. That's a part of their culture and their nature. And they have these children running around in these shirts with slits up the side, with their bottoms out, and their genitals flinging around. And they're doing this until they're in their late teens, early 20s. The amount of access they had to them is disgusting. In Luke's master, we have an extreme example of the master's Epicurean refinement manifested as blatant self-consumption. Over time, the punishing arm of the tyrant grew weaker and was finally paralyzed. He devolves into a degraded wreck of manhood, which does nothing to abate his sexual hunger or prevent the freaks of despotism that he perpetrates against Luke. It is not enough to simply think of Luke's master as an isolated freakish occurrence of sodomy, despotism, or sexual hunger. Rather, we should understand him as emblematic of the slave child's sexual vulnerability, overlapping with the nurturing of white children on the plantation. In our scholarly treatments of plantation sexuality, we have tended to emphasize the sexual hungers and desires of masters and mistresses as evidence of adult sexuality. But the rituals and appetites of Luke's master originate from childhood experiences. Connecting this notion of child sexuality to the topic of plantation rape, we readily acknowledge that white men raped Black women and that children learned such behaviors from their parents. Yet we rarely speak to the myriad of ways in which all white children on the plantation learned to eroticize and desire the slave. Harriet Beecher Stowe's young Eva cared after and chivalrously admired Tom, belied an insidious sexual reality in which children learned to associate the nurturing presence of mammies, toms, and uncle figures with incestuous sexuality and unrestrained appetite for the Negro. Stowe conceives of Eva as an angelic source of spiritual nourishment, a Christ-like supper that Tom, Patsy, and even Eva's father gratefully and mournfully consume. In reality, though, little Miss Eva literally fattened on the emotional and spiritual nourishment received from Black nursemaids and attendants. Miss Sarah, for example, a real-life version of the Eva character, pined and sickened and almost died when her father sold Mary Reynolds her personal slave. The local doctor orders Miss Sarah's father to buy back Mary, and when he does, Sarah plumps up right off and grows into fine health. What medical terminology can we use to so accurately describe the process and need of racialized consumption? What manner of child is this, so early conditioned to desire and pine for Black presence and care, that neither food, nor medicine, nor the promise of other material delights add flesh and well being to the child? Only the return and psychic repossession of her slave makes Miss Sarah plump up in a manner that defies medical science and our prevailing understandings of the energetic exchange between master and consumed slave. Luke's master is, at base, a helpless infant. Yet his punishment of and sexual attraction and sexual treatment of Luke reinforces the opposite reality. He dresses Luke like a plantation child, repeatedly chastises and punishes him for crimes he does not commit, and physically lowers him to a subservient position that allows the incapacitated master to feel larger and even more powerful. As a means of further binding and humiliating the young Black man, he chains Luke to his bedside, reinforcing in Luke the feeling of limitation, needfulness, and captivity that the master himself feels. So this is projection, because they project onto us the things that they feel and think about themselves. Generally speaking, whites like Luke's master cultivate a diverse range of rituals and ideologies designed to mask their own infantile hungers. The fame of Samuel A. Cartwright, who was a leading New Orleans physician, rested upon this inversionary mode of thinking. Cartwright's report on the diseases of and physical peculiarities of the Negro race, written in 1851, refers repeatedly to Negroes as children and newborn infants, dependent upon the parental care of slave owners. Cartwright attributes contrived medical diseases such as drapetomania, which is the phenomenon of Blacks running away from captivity, dysthesia aethiopis, which is a fatigue and resulting stupor from which neither punishment nor the threat of death could wake the slave, to the childlike nature of the Negro. Any person subjected to backbreaking labor from sunup to sundown would naturally, at some point, succumb to fatigue. Yet Cartwright describes this natural response to abuse and exhaustion as an African-based disease. Such systematized and ritualized practices of self-delusion and inversion made right, in the white mind, a twisted system of consumptive human relations. Earlier in this chapter, I described the master who habitually inverts his slaves, hanging them by their feet below a boiling fire and flesh cooking grease. I also described the slave who was literally fed into the cotton gin so that body and machine merge into one gruesome image of rot, consumption, and death. Such examples of systematized consumption take on an even more disturbing hue and significance within the domestic spheres of the plantation. While the rope, gurney, and metal gear constitute the external machinery of consumption, Luke's example helps us see some of the internal machinery: infantilization, childhood fantasies, nurturing, and parentage, fueling the larger culture of consumption. More of our intellectual energy needs to go towards analyzing childhood and the ideological infrastructure of childhood during slavery. When it comes to the topic of consumption under slavery, we cannot thoroughly engage the subject if we do not, from the outset, construct a theology, tel- yeah, te- te- a theology of the master that extends back at least to early childhood. For it means something entirely different to think about Luke's master as an adult child who is eroticizing and sexualizing Luke, who is himself infantilized and made to play the role of paternal caregiver. This way of thinking about Luke and his master disrupts conventional understandings of genealogy, sex, and relational dyads. Rather than regarding Luke as the slave and the white male as the master, we have Luke playing the role of child and adult, and the master playing the roles of adult child and ruling class adult through the discourses of sodomy and excessive dissipation. We know that Luke's master masturbated himself and probably Luke. We know that he probably either received or perpetrated anal copulation. In his weakened condition, it was probably Luke who was made to anally penetrate the master. But what we cannot know when we think solely in terms of sodomy is, for example, how anal penetration might have fed the child impulse, the impulse to be nurtured, to the master, or how such an impulse indicated a genealogy of appetites and hungers extending back to childhood. To extend the exploration of childhood, nurturing, and maternity even further, it could have been that acts of anal copulation or other sexual acts reinforced in the master the role of nurturing parent, paternity, or maternity. Ruling class whites habitually thought of themselves as bettering slaves through bondage and love, care, and compassion, extended to the slave in the context of the most heinous punishments and psychological abuses. Cartwright summed up this sentiment among whites, correlating discipline and the childlike nature of the Negro. He writes, although their skin is very thick, it is as sensitive when they are in perfect health as that of children, and like them, they fear the rod. Continuing these observations, Cartwright writes, they resemble children in another very important particular. They are very easily governed by love combined with fear, and are ungovernable, vicious, and rude under any form of government, whatever, not resting on love and fear as a basis. Like children, it is not necessary that they be kept under fear of the law. It is sufficient that they be kept under the fear of offending those who have authority over them. So we have been conditioned by this time to seek approval from a white ruling elite. And because we have been conditioned to seek the approval of a white ruling elite, because that meant life or death, that meant starvation and hunger or being fed, that meant rape or not rape, that meant peace or chaos in your life, then we learned to defer to them and to look to their pleasure, right, as a means of gauging our existence. Because if they were dissatisfied, our lives could be hell. Today we say it in the sense of, uh, if white America has a cold, Black America has pneumonia. The layers of and overlapping implications of what Luke means complicate and invert gender norms. Did Luke represent a masculinized or feminized child in the psychic world of the master? Did the master imagine himself as mothering or fathering Luke through daily ritualized beatings? Did Luke understand himself as cast in the role of man, woman, mother, father, husband, wife? Did he signify did he signify none of these or all of them to some combination? Was he chosen for particular male or female characteristics? Did his body parts and orifices, such as his mouth and anus, represent only pleasure and pain, or were they construed as sexual organs, female entrances, even a womb? I bring up all of these possibilities, the combination of bodies, body parts, and gender and sexual implications to clarify a point. When we talk about the invisibility of homoeroticism in the context of slavery, we are implicitly talking about norms of sex, gender, and so forth that inhibit our seeing. I mentioned David Walker at the beginning of this chapter in his fiery appeal correlated to the consumption of Black people under slavery with the saving powers of motherhood. They keep us miserable now, he laments, and call us their property. But some of them will have enough of us by and by. Their stomachs shall run over with us. They want us for their slaves and shall have us to their fill. Black men should rise up out of abject servility and be men, protecting their wives and mothers, writes Walker. Where slavery literally consumed the race, motherhood and the Black female womb had the power, in Walker's mind, to resuscitate and reconstitute the race. Using Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man as a reference, Trudier Harris describes the derogatory implications of the Black male grandmother, a figure from slavery and Reconstruction. Harrison describes Bledsoe, the Booker T. Washington-like character from the novel, as grandmotherly Bledsoe. She says that he approaches the mammy figure in the extent of his concern for the white person who is in his care. His primary goal is to soothe Norton, who is the wealthy white man, as the precious child whose welfare rests in his hands. To comfort the child, the grandmother must show him that the danger which threatened him is no longer real. Examples of the Walker and Harris variety proliferate within the African American history and letters. Walker's notion of the saving Black maternal womb and Harris's idea of the Black male grandmother have much to do with Luke and the topic of homoeroticism during slavery. Yet in a commitment to a didactic mode of thinking, such as masculinity, femininity, consume, not consume, and infinite adult, we have tended to overlook interconnections and overlaps. Luke's master is as much a representative of the patriarchal institution as he is a byproduct of conventions and sentimentality tied to motherhood and maternity. Luke gives birth to his master's domination and psychic stability at the same time that the master births Luke's, makes meaning of his life and person within a consumptive framework. The discourse of hunger and human consumption also have a constructive function. At the same time, they proscribe and delimit Black bodies in Jacob's narrative. They allow us to think more broadly about homoeroticism as an index for inversions, body disfigurements, and transgressions of gender and sex norms that recur throughout Jacob's narrative. So he's saying they had a symbiotic relationship, that for all of the abuses that Luke experienced, he fed on that, just as the master fed on this weakened, slack Black man that he had created. I again still contend Luke was doing it for survival. He became what he had to become so that he could survive, because he saw that life was the only goal. Life and living and existence on this material plane was the only end, because death is death. That's another world, that's another realm, that you'll have no memory of this life. I believe Luke was doing what he did for survival. You can't make me see it any other way. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. You know, and then you have to remember, this is written from the perspective of a white, liberal, queer person who is trying to make excuses for and explain away and implant ideas in our minds about Black homoerotic behaviors. Based on my understandings, there may have been queerness in the Black community, but its prevalence is because a Black male can be anything but a man in a white supremacist environment, because homosexuality is not prevalent like that on the continent. It's just not. But in a white supremacist environment, in a post-colonial environment, in the American context, a Black male can be anything but a man. He can be a boy, a girl, a woman, right? But he cannot be a man. And because he cannot be a man, then he defaults to being effeminate, soft, weak, yielding to and preferring the white penis over the Black vagina, because they can replace in their mind's eye the Black vagina with a white anus, and they will have power, because in this perspective of a white supremacist world, that is the most powerful thing, is a white male who has been transformed into taking the place of the most powerful creature on earth, which is the Black woman and the Black man unifying. So, continuing. Hunger and gender inversion. I have attempted to demonstrate up to this point that when we talk about male rape and more broadly homoeroticism during slavery, we are implicitly addressing the power in the form of gender, sex, and corporeality. The open-ended nature of Luke's example, the resolute meanings we can never fully achieve from his body, sex, and gender, represents both a challenge and a number of theoretical potentials. We can marshal these potentials and apply them to the broader understandings of motherhood, consumption, hunger, and resistance in Jacob's narrative in 19th century culture in general. Luke's incomplete story and the incomplete record of homoeroticism within the historical record coincides with the relentless drive within the African American history and letters to achieve completion or at least to convey completion at the levels of gender, sex, and body. It is as if this whole time we have striven against the possibility of a body that is part machine and part corporal entity. I am referring to that body enmeshed in the cotton gin, the body that is part machine, part rot, part torso. In Luke, this threat of disfigurement takes the form of reversed paternal child roles and body parts that are so disfigured that we can ascertain their shapes and shadowy forms only through discourses of filth, despotism, and a restraining sentimental silence. What would it mean, though, to think about Jacob's in particular and Black womanhood and maternity more broadly as incomplete frameworks? What I mean here by incomplete is this. What if they did not fully and neatly facilitate the ideas of racial uplift or female reproductivity as saving? What if Jacobs did not construct Black femininity to complement the sufferings and subjectivity of Black male patriarchs? More broadly, what would that model of Black femininity, what would be that model of Black femininity that did not respond, that did not correct ideas of Black taint and licentiousness? Through these questions, I am attempting to convey what I am attempting to convey is that in rendering, say, Jacob's personal genealogy as a political response, albeit to repressive forces, we miss out on her hunger. We miss out on a fuller understanding of her sexuality as opposed to her reproductive capacity. Jacob's sexuality, above and beyond the significance of motherhood and reproductive capacity, has become increasingly more important to ascertain. Yet her sexuality, outside of maternity, is rarely given full treatment within Black feminists and feminist scholarship more broadly. What would it mean to break open, pry apart, and hold in kind of a suspended animation the very infrastructures that have allowed us to pursue our relatively complete understandings of maternity, female genealogy, and sexuality, for example, in Jacob's narrative and in slave culture more broadly? In terms of infrastructures, what comes most readily to mind is the logic of gender and sex operating through recollections of sexual abuse in Jacob's narrative. Summing up this system, Jacobs writes, it makes the white fathers cruel and sensual, the sons violent and licentious. It contaminates the daughters and makes the wives wretched. To break it down further, Jacob plots sons on the plantation as coming under the unclean influences of their fathers. This leads them to rape young Black women. Daughters hear their father's sexual indiscretions, which also leads them to rape and violate the daughters. Curiosity is excited, and they soon learn the cause. They are attended by the young slave girls whom their fathers have corrupted, and they hear such talk as should never meet youthful ears or any other ears. They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases, they exercise the same authority over the men slaves. And wives, as more or less helpless victims, respond wretchedly to their husbands' inattentions. In the narrative, a good example of this is Mrs. Flint's crimsoning and weeping as she has Jacobs relate to her all of the lurid details of her husband's sexual advances. Missing from this matrix of sexual desire are any references to homoeroticism. In presenting this dynamic, Jacobs presumes that the father's desire runs one way, from male to female, and that all other desires conform to this rule. With Luke, though, we have a clear example of that not being the case. Luke's master embodies a genealogy of white male desire that runs across, betwixt, and between gender and sex norms. In Luke, the master satiates maternal as well as paternal needs, the young slave representing nativity, home space, and a site of pastoral pleasure. Luke's body and body parts traverse feminine as well as masculine physicality. Not to mention the master, who simultaneously plays the role of needy child, parasite, and adult tyrant. Jacob's narrative is the story of Black male maternity, Black maternity and womanhood. Jacob's narrative is the story of Black maternity and womanhood. It is a story centrally concerned with evasion and pursuit, the master pursuer and the enslaved young woman who constantly evades her pursuer. In order for the narrative of pursuit to work, gender and sex have to stand still while the framework of erotic desire stemming from the plantation master takes center stage. Ironically, Jacobs reifies the white male paternity that she seeks to displace, from which she endeavors to disentangle herself through a sexual logic in which the master is always the central node, giving meaning and motility to all other erotic desires on the plantation. Through this model, we can never get at or make sense of Dr. Flint's playing the role of male mother to Jacobs, or his wife simulating mock intercourse with the young slave girl. See that? His wife simulating mock intercourse with the young slave girl. So she had to get the husband off and the wife off. Such fluid expressions of gender complicate and challenge our base presumptions about the master's masculinity and belie an altogether different framing of desire. And even if we were to accept that the patriarch was at the center and that daughters raped Black men, that still does not account for the erotic dynamics between white women and their Black female nursemaids, mammies, aunties, and playmates. Before Black men, white women had access to Black women and girls. They learned to eroticize and sexualize Black women and girls in ways that often had little to do with the sex drives of fathers and brothers. This is not to say that white women did not rape and entice Black men on the plantation, because they did. But what I am most concerned with is how Jacobs and history on the whole have tended to overlook the most obvious and more primary level of erotic interaction for white women, the relationships between white and Black women. More and more texts are emerging that document the relationships among women on the plantation, between white and Black women, and between Black women and their own communal settings. However, from the general studies, such as Elizabeth Fox Genovese's Within the Plantation Household, Black and White Women of the Old South, written in 1988, to Marley F. Weiner's Mistresses and Slaves, Plantation Women in South Carolina, 1830 to 1880, written in 1998, to Deborah Gray's focus on the Black female, Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South, written in 1985. The subject of eroticism among women on the plantation remains largely untreated. I mentioned in the previous chapter on Douglass that the only text that I know of to make overt reference to sexual dynamics between women on the plantation is Nell Irvin's Painter's Sojourner Truth, A Life Assemble, offering some insight into why Black women at the time said virtually nothing about the sexual abuse at the hands of white women. Painter writes, Truth had two motives for keeping the secrets by the time she told her story. Having come through a libel trial in the mid 1830s, she was concerned with her credibility. She also feared that because what had happened to her was so unaccountable, so unreasonable, and what is usually called so unnatural, readers who were uninitiated would not believe her. Connecting the uninitiated of the past to the uninitiated of the present, Painter confirms that then as now, the sexual abuse of young women by men is deplored but recognized as common. Less easily acknowledged then and now is the fact that there are women who violated children. We can only speculate about to the extent to which shame and the emphasis upon reason and nature have kept us from these deeper realities of Black female experience. White women, speaking about the hard facts of slavery, risked being thought of as sexually licentious, or even worse, as unsexed. For Black women, the risk was even greater, as whites de facto linked their sexuality with African wilds, physical disfigurement, and the horses, dogs, and other domestic animals to which Thomas Jefferson compared Blacks in his Notes on the State of Virginia. In Jacob's own life, her grandmother serves as an object of white female desire, eroticization, nurturing, and consumptive appetites. Long before Dr. Flint comes into the picture, marrying Jacobs's mistress, selling her grandmother, and pursuing the young Jacobs as his concubine, Mrs. Flint has learned from elderly women in her family about the erotic utility of and serviceability of the Black woman. The scene that culminates this history is another bedroom scenario that calls to mind a number of dynamics that play out in Luke's abuse. Jacob's mistress, like Luke's master, confines the young woman to a room adjoining her bedroom. As with Luke, expectations of sacrifice and service fuel sexualized brutality. And also, similar to Luke's scenario, appetite and hunger enable a fluid sense of gender and sexuality. Let me describe the significant details of the scenario before correlating it further with Luke's abuse and an overarching dynamic of Black female consumption. Motivated by jealousy and humiliation, Mrs. Flint takes Jacobs into her bedroom. Her actions, according to Jacobs, are a knee-jerk reaction to her husband's sexual pursuit of the young slave girl. She pulls her aside, hands her a Bible, and says, "Lay your hand on your heart, kiss this holy book, and swear before God that you tell me the truth." The truth being that Jacobs has not succumbed to sexual advancements of Flint. At this point in the narrative, Miss Flint, consumed by her erotic obsessions, comes to fixate on Jacobs. She imagines Jacobs as a seductress, assumes her guilty before the young woman can prove her innocence, and then wants all of the sordid details which cause Miss Flint to alternately blush, weep, groan, and moan. She seems to blame Jacobs for her degraded state. Jacobs imagines Flint as a byproduct of her husband's desire. She paints her as powerless and pitiable. Yet it is my contention that Miss Flint is the perfect portrait of what Morrison has described as the reckless, unabated power of a white woman gathering identity unto herself from the wholly available and serviceable lives of Africanist others. The deeper issue within the confessional confines of the bedroom is not Flint's pursuit of Jacobs or vice versa, but the utter powerlessness of this white woman who receives neither love, devotion, nor any semblance of affection from her cruel, predatory husband. Jacobs does her best to render the white woman in a pitiable, compassionate light in this particular moment. But everywhere else in the narrative suggests that her situation is endemic to the culture of consumption. These facts I will take up shortly. For the moment, we have Miss Flint, convinced that Jacobs tells the truth regarding her husband. To thwart his sexual schemes, she takes Jacobs to sleep in an adjoining room, in a room adjoining her own. Jacobs imagines in her mistress, a saving presence. However, her feelings of safety and saving are short lived, as Miss Flint begins a nightly vigil that terrifies the girl and causes her to fear for her life. Sometimes I woke up and found her bending over me. At other times, she whispered in my ear as though it was her husband who was speaking to me, and listened to hear what I would answer. If she startled me on such occasions, she would glide stealthily away. At last, I began to be fearful for my life. It had been often threatened, and you can imagine, better than I can describe, what an unpleasant sensation it must produce to wake up in the dead of night and find a jealous woman bending over you. Greetings, Light Beam 720. Thank you so much for tuning in. Deborah M. Garfield finds the positioning of the woman's body sexually suggestive. She refers to the mistress as performing mock intercourse with Jacobs. Garfield describes Miss Flint alternatively as a stand in for her husband, a type of male impersonator, and enacting a role reversal that stems back to Flint, the patriarch and motivating figure with the incestuous plantation household. Garfield explains Jacob's motives for her depiction of this scenario as an attempt to replicate the sexual act and to block her reader from its reality. This scenario, according to Garfield, is yet another example of Jacob's following child's instruction and foreclosing sexual details that would offend and taint her female reader. The bottom line, Miss Flint's imitations are still grounded in her husband's physical and discursive presence. My only problem with Garfield's provocative analysis is that it denies the deeper meaning of Miss Flint's erotic proximity. her, Miss Flint's, sexual fantasies about Jacobs, and her, Miss Flint's, sexual agency independent of her husband. Garfield's analysis adheres religiously to the scheme I referred to earlier of erotic desire originating in the white patriarch and informing the son, daughter, and wife. The meaning of the mistress's transgendered behavior is for Garfield an esoteric occurrence that underscores how, in the master slave dialectic, roles can be mystically exchanged in narrative but never permanently escaped. In other words, the specter of the master's hunger and desire is always present, animating and acting through his wife, who inexplicably takes on his voice and sexual appetites. All this perceived effort to disguise Dr. Flint's desire and presence makes no sense, given, as Painter points out, that the sexual abuse of women by their masters as a commonly noted occurrence. I submit that what has truly mystified and deified articulation has been female sexuality under slavery, and in particular, erotic ties between Black women and white women. Painter's comments about Sojourner Truth situation applies as well to Jacobs, which is that to call attention to the homoerotic interests of white mistresses would have undermined the ethos of Black women's claims to motherhood and womanhood. The motherhood and womanhood, even of the plantation mistress, has to remain pristine and inviolate if the thesis of patriarchal desire is the primary corrupter of female innocence was to apply. In reality, what Jacobs foregrounds, white women did not corrupt white women or learn to eroticize Black women through primary relations with mammies and other caretaker figures. Painter notes that less easily acknowledged then and now is the fact that there are women who violate children. Yet, with the plantation conceived of by whites as a household, and Blacks always infantilized and eroticized infants, how could the mistress not find herself seduced by the sex and power dynamic that was reinforced everywhere around her? As Morrison asserts, how could she not hunger, become reckless, and learn through osmosis the process of gathering identity unto herself from the completely available and expendable source of the female chattel slave? Beyond the basic issues of sex and violation, Morrison finds the white mistress and female slave dialectic the coordinates of an intensely important moral debate. Morrison's observations call to mind the 19th century debate about Christian cannibalism. Such a notion did not easily translate into concept and terminology. By the late 1800s, white identity on the plantation was so deeply wedded to the unspeakable practices of consumption that whites themselves could not see and therefore could not name the specter and terror of the emerging white civilized cannibal. Even the idea of child molestation forwarded by Painter does not convey the dynamic overlay of consumption upon sex, of consumptive hungers driving the erotic interchange between Mrs. Flint and Jacobs. We cannot separate Mrs. Flint in the bedroom, acting as both master and mistress, from Mrs. Flint, the parasite and consumer practiced in the methodology of slave consumption. Mrs. Flint was well versed in the language and ideology of consumption. She threatened her slaves with skin peeling and pickling. She spit in all the pots after the cook had finished the big house meal in order to prevent the cook or any other slave from eking out their meager fare with the remains of the gravy and other scrapings. She rationed out the food and starved her slaves as a means of maintaining psychic and emotional control. Providing further insight into her character, Jacobs observes Mrs. Flint, like many Southern women, was totally deficient in energy. She had not the strength to superintend her household affairs, but her nerves were so strong that she could sit in her easy chair and see a woman whipped till the blood trickled from every stroke of the lash. Miss Flint lacks the power and vitality, yet strongly demonstrates these traits in the context of torture and subjugation of Black females. For women like Miss Flint, the plantation was a spiritual and emotional wasteland. Such women hungered and even starved for the affections and attentions of their husbands. They learned to harden and deaden themselves to physical and psychological abuses, and furthermore, in the context of such brutalities, developed a method of nurturing and sustaining themselves by drawing upon the erotic, psychic energy of Black women. In the bedroom scenario, Mrs. Flint takes Jacobs into her special care. She channels her sexual frustration regarding her husband, her jealousy and hatred into nightly vigils, into rituals of erotic interchange that usually end with whispers and Jacob's awakening to the woman leaning over her in the dead of night. Jacobs feels an unnamed terror. At last, she says, I began to be fearful for my life. It had been often threatened. Terrible as this experience was, I had fears that it would give place to one more terrible. Sex and consumption fueled Dr. Flint's constant threats against Jacob's life. Similarly, Mrs. Flint, with the threat of death, commingled with sex, so that we cannot know for sure if the terrible act that Jacobs imagines is molestation and rape at the hands of the mistress beating her to death, or death by some other heinous, unspeakable means. The point is that we do not have to know the particulars to understand how thoroughly interwoven is this moment with same sex eroticism and with a socially sanctioned white female hunger and appetite. Jacobs locates the roots of all this in The Good Doctor and in plantation patriarchy. However, the problem with Dr. Flint's desire, male patriarchal desire, as the glue that holds all of this together, is that his example overshadows and inhibits our access to more central domestic operations. More specifically, I am thinking of the intimate female-centered ways in which a woman, such as Mrs. Flint, learns to objectify and erotically consume a Black woman slave. Replacing Flint with someone like Jacob's grandmother would take us a lot further in recovering Mrs. Flint's learned practices of social consumption. Aunt Marthy, who was Jacob's grandmother, does not stand out in the narrative as someone who suffers from social consumption. As Jacob struggles for her life, this elderly Black woman is free, a landowner, and property owner, and is considered an upstanding member of the community. In her goodness of moral character and domestic practices, Aunt Marthy seems to be in no way connected to the cruelty, meanness, and consumptive urges of Jacob's mistress. Aunt Marthy is a typical good grandmother from Black antebellum experience. Miss Moses Roper describes in his slave narrative how his grandmother comes into the slave cabin and saves him in childhood from the murdering knife of the slave mistress. In Douglas's narrative, the caring, sustaining Black grandmother replaces the absent mother. So, too, in Jacob's narrative, does the grandmother come to represent the whole of Black maternity. She, even better than the mother, helps establish racial continuity, maternity, and female virtue as inherent phenomena. Both Jacobs and her editor or benefactress, Lydia Maria Child, seized upon the idea of the good grandmother as a way of refuting Northern whites' ideas of Black women as bad, unclean, and natally dead. Child even published an excerpt of Jacob's narrative under the title The Good Grandmother in her 1865 text, The Freedman's Book. Jacob's grandmother fits the typical role of the mammy figure, a nurturing Black woman beloved by all who could do anything and do it better than anyone else. Because of her expertise in all domestic matters, she was the premier house servant and all others were her subordinates. Whites in the community referred to the grandmother as auntie or mammy. Underlying all of the goodness and affection associated with the mammy was an undercurrent of cruelty and self-sacrifice from which young white women, such as Miss Flint, benefited. For it was implicitly understood that unlike that of the Jezebel, the role of the mammy displaced sexuality into nurture and transformed potential hostility into sustenance and love. Devoid of sexuality, the mammy served as a font of nurturing. She was the perfect emotional playground, the perfect vehicle through which young white women could work out and practice their need, their sexual hostility, and other types of aggression. Mrs. Flint learns in the suckling stage of her development this utilitarian purpose of the mammy figure. Years and generations later, it still pains Aunt Marthy that while nursing her female child, she had to take her own baby from her breast to nourish his wife, Mrs. Flint. Even when Mrs. Flint is dismissive of Jacob's grandmother, not greeting her when she passes her in the street, the Black woman, because of her abiding feelings, cannot completely disconnect from the white woman. Jacobs relates that such public treatment wounded my grandmother's feelings, for she could not retain ill will against the woman whom she had nourished with her milk when a babe. Jacob's grandmother and Mrs. Flint have an entirely different expectation of the maternal bond that binds them. Mrs. Flint's nurturing in infancy is intrinsically tied to the starvation of and emotional denial of the slave. Her spitting in pots, denying food to her cook and her cook's children are gestures that reflect the domination of her white womanhood and the kindred tie that she has learned from her mothers and her aunts and at the breast of Aunt Marthy. Mrs. Flint's mother, while more subtle and refined in her appetites, maintains rituals of social consumption that devolve upon the Black mammy figure. By the time we encounter Jacob's grandmother in the narrative, she is a free woman. Her freedom from slavery is not so much given as it is earned through backbreaking labor and sacrifice. She does her plantation chores as well as additional baking, washing, and other jobs in order to save up money to purchase her freedom and that of family members. Before her mistress dies, the elderly white woman borrows $300 from Aunt Marthy to purchase a silver candelabra. She promises to pay the money back and free Aunt Marthy upon her death. She never pays the money back and only frees the Black woman after she has died and has no further use of her. Her will and testament reflects her promise to free Aunt Marthy, but Dr. Flint does not honor the will. Instead, he puts the grandmother up for sale at a private auction. Adding insult to injury, he also keeps the silver candelabra as part of his personal cachet of precious household wares. Jacobs paints a classic sentimental scene around the selling of her grandmother. When the day of the sale came, she took her place among the chattels. And at the first call, she sprang up on the auction block. Many voices called out, "Shame, shame! Who's going to sell you, Aunt Marthy? Don't stand there. This is no place for you. That is no place for you." Without saying a word, she quietly awaited her fate. No one bid for her. At last, a feeble voice said, $50. It came from a maiden lady, 70 years old, the sister of my deceased grandmother's mistress, of my grandmother's deceased mistress. She had lived 40 years under the same roof with my grandmother. She knew how faithfully she had served her owners and how cruelly she had been defrauded of her rights, and she resolved to protect her. Miss Fanny purchases the Black woman for the extremely low price of $50. Jacobs casts white women such as Miss Fanny and her sister in the role of protectress and as honorable keepers of their word, good, conscionable, and ladylike. The author has little to say of the silver candelabra purchased with the money saved by an enslaved woman to purchase her freedom and that of her children, for the sake of her white female readership. Jacob emphasizes instead the good intentions of the deceased mistress and the system of self-sacrifice and reward that ultimately secures the freedom of Aunt Marthy. Flint serves as a type of pressure valve through which Jacobs filters all of the contradiction and irony of the grandmother's predicament. He is the executor of the elder white woman's will. He keeps the candelabra, and he advertises the selling of Jacob's grandmother. Flint fits seamlessly into this role, since we already have come to associate him with greed and extreme sexual appetite. Yet we should not too hastily separate the refinement and good taste of Aunt Marthy's mistress from the social consumption of the Black mammy. If Flint is a despot and pariah, then it is his wife's influence and her deceased grandmother's wealth that infuses and animates his desires. By law, Jacobs and her children belong to Flint's wife. While Flint is brash and blatant, his appetites and devouring nature pronounced throughout the narrative, the consumptive drives of the deceased white mistress remain cloaked in finery and social affluence. The silver candelabra serves as an emblem of her good taste, an article recognized in the domestic sphere as beautiful, tasteful, and feminine. In this way, the grandmother's labor and state of enslavement feed into the sustained feed into, and sustain this white woman's self esteem and domestic virtue. The characteristics of self sacrifice and self negation typically ascribed to the mammy facilitate this white woman in fulfilling her fantasies of material well being and social finery. Jacob's configuration of the godly, goodly black grandmother and the beneficent white female does not readily reveal the ties of consumption binding the black grandmother to her mistress. In Jacob's version of her history, she encourages us to perceive no connection between the acquired high cultural tastes of Miss Flint's grandmother and of Miss Flint's starving of her slaves and hovering over Jacob's at night in a sexually suggestive manner. The nursing of the young white mistress in infancy apparently has nothing to do with the institutionalized starving of the black woman's children on the plantation. To clarify, I am not suggesting that we replace the good with the bad, recasting Miss Flint's grandmother, for example, as a bad white woman who does not free her slave and steals the money of the black woman that this steals the money the black woman has saved to purchase her freedom. What I am encouraging and urging is a more complex understanding of good, of the fact that we cannot divorce a white slave mistress's good intentions from the spiritual depravity and practices of social consumption that shaped her. So what he's saying is that this woman had inherited money, land, slaves, and the candelabra from her grandmother. And those experiences shaped her into who she was. And so she was shaped by this grandmother that had tricked a black woman out of her freedom and gotten a very expensive household ware, something beautiful in exchange for it. And she had suckled at the breast of this black woman when she was an infant. But even walking down the street, she treated the black woman like she was nothing. And the black woman, they're saying, was so compassionate towards her that it hurt her feelings to not be acknowledged by this white woman who had suckered at her breast, which is crazy, crazy work. I have no doubt that Miss Flint's mother cared deeply for my Aunt Marthy. Neither do I doubt the affections of the larger white community whom she supplied with crackers and preserves, and who respected her intelligence and good character. The whites who yell out, "Shame, shame, who is going to sell you?" Aunt Marthy, don't stand there. That is no place for you. Have grown up at the nurturing breast and spoon of Aunt Marthy. The well-shined silver candelabra, she is familiar and valued fixture. Like the well-shined silver candelabra, she is a familiar and valued fixture in their emotional and psychic worlds. They imagine her as a surrogate mother, familiar, and relative, and hence the spectacle of the black woman on the auction block shocks them. Mary Prince, a black woman who experienced slavery around the same time, likened the auction block to the butcher block. Standing for auction, as I have mentioned once, she recalls, I was soon surrounded by strange men who examined and handled me in the same manner a butcher would a lamb or a calf he was about to purchase, and who talked about my shape and size and words and like words, as if I could no more understand their meaning than the dumb beasts. The whites imagine Aunt Marthy as separate and apart from the economy of human consumption that Prince describes. What they seem to not realize, though, is that their regard for the mammy's self-sacrifice and overbrimming goodness serve only to oil and ease the machinery of consumption. What I am attempting to tease out through this auction block scene is the difference between the institution of consumption and the intimate human ties that fueled and enabled this system. It was one thing for whites to construct gurneys and ropes or to literally feed a slave into a machine such as a cotton gin. And it was an altogether different matter for them to feel, as one Kentucky master felt, a sense of complete enjoyment and completion in the consumption of the slave. We have already observed that after literally butchering and cooking his slave's quarter body over an open fire, this Kentucky slave owner reported to his wife that he had never enjoyed himself so well at a ball as he had enjoyed himself that evening. I am not equating the whites gathered round the auction block with the heinousness of this particular slave master. This man was more insane than most and later committed suicide. Yet his example of acquiring a taste for the Negro is instructive. It demonstrates in the extreme how whites within a culture of consumption could not help but develop taste, affection, and high cultural values rooted in the chattel slave. I see little difference between the Kentucky slave owner who associates the butchering and cooking of flesh with ballroom refinery and the whites gathered around the auction block associated sacred maternal feelings with a Black woman who is at base an owned object, a utilitarian repository of their infantile memories and needs. It is the good in these whites and not the bad that completes the circuit, the logic of need and self-denial that undergirds mechanisms of consumption. Without the intimate feel-good tie between Mammy and her white progeny, there could be no psychic and spiritual consumption. Without ideological and symbolic structures intended to validate the Mammy's consumption, there could be no sanity in this essentially inverted reality, which is why, getting back to the bedroom interactions between Mrs. Flint and Jacobs, we need different structures of erotic desire, gender, and intimacy to help us make a broader sense of slave experience within this essentially unstable, hunger-driven context. We cannot get from here to there to an understanding of the masculine mistress or of Jacob's fears of death and sexual violation through models of gender and sex that always privilege the patriarch and the male-female conjugal union as natural and originary states. So what he's saying, what I understand him to be saying, is that we have to look outside of the male-female gender norms for sexual relationships in order to understand these experiences that Harriet Jacobs had with her mistress, Mrs. Flint. Mrs. Flint does not simulate masculinity as some have suggested, nor does she simulate the master's erotic desire and dominion. She is masculine. She is aggressor and predator. She comes naturally by a restless, craving, vicious nature that causes her to rove about, like her husband, day and night, seeking whom to devour. Her masculine drive originates in the domestic sphere, a fact that goes against the usual ways of thinking about the feminine as linked to the domestic realm and about masculinity as originating within the male body and the male sex drive. Describing Miss Flint as whispering in her husband's voice and adopting his erotic mindset is as close as Jacobs can safely come to asserting that Mrs. Flint is male, acting male, seeming to her senses and sensibilities to be male. Such discussion of a male type of female was risky, as it could be easily used to support commonly held notions of women as hungering and disfigured, and Black women in particular as sexually knowledgeable, monstrous, and devouring. Social conventions limited Jacobs, as did her reliance upon a pristine, untainted model of womanhood. However, these discursive limitations upon Jacobs need not restrict our exploration of gender variance in the narrative. Miss Flint's masculinity makes greater sense when we think about her through the ideology of slave consumption. Miss Flint's male behaviors serve as an index of appetite and consumptive capacity. Jacobs understands slavery as sexual ravishment and sexual ravishment as a process that facilitates the consumption of the female slave. She lays out this ideology when she speaks of Dr. Flint as hungering and devouring, and as one who consistently channels these appetites into acts of sexual domination. More than anything, Miss Flint hungers like a man, a fact that shocks and terrifies Jacobs as she lies beneath her mistress in the dead of night. Only through this deeper understanding of and contextualization of masculinity can we understand how important and intrinsic hunger and consumption are to the white female's gender and domestic identity. We might even say, in a way that scholars up to this point have not allowed, that hunger and appetite are constitutive of gender and sex within the plantation context. Does hunger then come before sex and gender, or do the former categories come before the latter? It is a question that merits extensive examination beyond the purview of this study. I point out the correlation between hunger and gender categorizations only so that we might understand how the masculinity of the mistress is a significant point of fact. As opposed to being a male mask, the mistress's male identity is more a reflection of an intrinsic consumptive capacity that we cannot otherwise get at within the lexicon of 19th century gender roles. Not just in Mrs. Flint, but in other slave owners, we find hunger depicted as fluid, mutable, and able to conform to myriad social conventions. In other parts of the narrative, Jacobs documents plantation mistresses who taunt and pursue their female slaves with the might of a man. Even Flint does not operate out of a strict sense of patriarchal authority. At one point, he writes to Jacobs in the guise of a slave mistress. He wants her to voluntarily return home after having escaped the plantation. He entreats, "The family will be rejoiced to see you, and your poor old grandmother expressed a great desire to have you come when she heard your letter read. In her old age, she needs the consolation of having her children around her," adding another layer of sentimentality to his maternal voice. Flint describes an all night vigil at the bedside of Jacob's dying aunt. "Could you have seen us around her deathbed with her mother, all mingling our tears in one common stream? You would have thought the same heartfelt tie existed between a master and his servant as between a mother and her child." Flint manipulates the consumptive currency of the Black mammy. He plays upon Jacob's mother loss and mother hunger, hoping to entice her back through her unrequited needs. Explaining the correlation between emotional and physical starvation and sexual ravishment, Jacobs reveals that the slave girl is reared in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear. When she is 14 or 15, her owner or his sons or the overseer, or perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped or starved into submission to their will. When we figure hunger centrally into the equation of gender and sex in the narrative, what we presume to know about certain normative realms of experience gives way to a fluid uncertainty. How are we to make sense of masters who speak in the voices of young mistresses? And to what extent can we rely upon a patriarchal model of consumption when women such as Miss Flint's grandmother anticipate and enable the consumptive passions of her son-in-law, Dr. Flint? Male mothers and female masters. We're almost done, guys. We only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 more pages. So I'm sorry it's taking so long. We should be done by 1:15. And hopefully you guys will have a question or two or want to highlight something that you heard, but we're almost done. I began this discussion of gender variance and the master's Epicurean hungers with the example of Luke. By beginning with Luke and then exploration of his gender and sexual ambiguity, then tracking similar findings in Jacob's life and circumstances, my intention was to denude us of certain binary logics and relationships, things like man, woman, black female abolitionist, white female abolitionist, master, mistress, reproductive, neutered, among others. In response to my own question about how to make sense of Flint as a male grandmother and the inherently masculine appetites of Mrs. Flint, I think that we need to begin from an implied zero ground: the unstable sex, gender, and corporeality of the slave. So what he's saying is that we need to dismiss any ideas of slaves' sexuality and their preferences because their preferences didn't matter. In the context of Jacob's slave narrative, the Flint's gender fluidity rests upon the bedrock of gender and sex presumptions attributed to the body and person of the slave. Both Jacobs and Luke, I have labored to prove, embodied the central dynamic of gender and sex instability in their relationships to abusive masters within same-sex erotic scenarios that defy normative schemas of gender and sex formation. The master-slave dynamic, as fruitful as it is, can only take us so far in understanding how gender variance and gender fluidity have historically operated in the lives of enslaved persons. What I have in mind this whole time is Luke and Jacobs together constituting a new and dynamic field of possibility. For they are not just anonymous actors in Jacob's narrative, but historical antecedents to Sapphire, who enacts her old man in drag, and to Trudaire Harris's conception of the black male mammy who services white men on the plantation and during the Reconstruction era. In the slave past and still today, the gender variant dyad of black male and female functions as an antinoid of Black experience, that dynamic that we have privately and silently acknowledged, but still have disavowed in all ways in the public domain. Hortense J. Spillers has quite astutely identified the politics of gender differentiation as central to Black subject making in the New World. Spillers conceives of the captivity in Africa and the Middle Passage as a theft of the body, a willful and violent severing of the captive body from its motive, will, its active desire. So when I say that a slave's sexuality and sexual preference didn't matter, this is highlighting that fact that the theft of the body and a willful and violent severing of the captive body from its motive will, right? So you didn't have the chance to say, I don't want to do this because it's not what I prefer. I'm not like that. That's not my preference. You didn't have those choices. You submitted or you didn't survive it. She also equates this theft of the Black body with the loss of gender identity for Black people in the New World. Under these conditions, we lose at least gender difference in the outcome, and the female body and the male body become a territory and cultural and political maneuver, not at all gender related, or gender specific. That, I think, is more hyperbole being put forth by the editor, because he has a desire to degender or disengender the Black male and the Black female, right? In the modern era, because he's a queer man and he's a queer white liberal. So he has an incentive here to say that, oh, in the New World, Black men and Black women don't have gender roles and gender identity. And because they don't have these gender roles and gender identity because of enslavement, then this doesn't matter to them now. Okay. In the absence of gender specificity of distinctive categories of gender, Spillers finds the enslaved Black body functioning in European and white American imaginations as a category of otherness, the captive body translating into a potential for pornotroping and embodying sheer physical powerlessness that slides into a more general powerlessness resonating through various centers of human and social meaning. Who can contest Spiller's spot-on analysis of gender ambiguity coinciding with white American conceptions of Black anomality, disfigurement, sexual taint, and the clandestine pornotroping that has characterized white erotic access to Black bodies under slavery? So we are responding to what they made us during our enslavement. Colonial era whites constructed Black slave, chattel, and African to mean qualitatively nothing and virtually anything. These indeterminate categories, whites then mapped into Black male and female bodies in overlapping and indiscriminate ways. Miller's well-stated point is that this gender ambiguity mapped onto Negroid bodies helped concretize the exclusion of African Americans from the humane categories of mother, father, statesman, son, daughter, citizen, and so forth. So this otherization of us has firmly planted seeds in the minds of most white people that we can't be a mother, father, statesman, son, daughter, or citizen, because we're something other than what they are. Our women, our women are masculinized. Our males are feminized. Our children are sexualized. We are told that we don't have the power to or ability to um, run our own communities. We are told that we don't have the rights of others, of citizens, because we can be shot down on the street. Running is the most criminal thing a Black person can do, because running puts us in a place and perspective of a slave, right? The challenge, though, with what Spillers describes as the political imperative to differentiate between genders, is that within African Americanist scholarship, this gender politics has contributed to a theoretical aversion to gender and sex instability. We have yet to fully develop and recover the ability to see Black culture as positively cultured through fluid gender and sex dynamic. For example, in Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism, Bell Hooks conceives the masculinization of the Black female and the demasculinization of the Black male as primarily dysfunctional experiences that can only reveal to us the dynamics of sexist and racist oppression during slavery. Hooks got it right there. Hooks, keeping to a strict understanding of Black demasculinization as the loss of the phallus, of phallic might, asserts that while Black men were not forced to assume a role colonial American society regarded as feminine, Black women were forced to assume a role as a masculine. Black women were forced to assume a masculine role. Hooks's rigid conception of gender forecloses from the outset any consideration of men such as Luke, who were feminized and made to play a range of social roles that transgress normative gender roles. Angela Y. Davis, in her pioneering scholarship on Black women's roles during slavery, locates the idea of the genderless Black female in plantation labor practices, saying, expediency governed the slaveowner's posture towards female slaves. When it was profitable to exploit them as if they were men, they were regarded in effect as genderless. Davis also equates the genderless Black woman and female masculinity with the negative intentions of the master and the sense of the genderless Black woman as lacking power and social agency. Michelle Wallace has linked Black cultural workers' longstanding aversion to gender and sex fluidity to the 80s radical Black sexual politics. Describing the Black homosexual as descending from Black women raped during slavery, she writes, the Black homosexual is counter-revolutionary, one, because he's being fucked, and two, because he's being fucked by a white man. By doing so, he reduces himself to the status of our Black grandmothers who, as everyone knows, were fucked by white men all the time. And as with Hooks, Wallace conceives of sexual variance within radical Black experiences as a reflection of the dynamics of sexist and racist oppression during slavery. How unfortunate that association with Black female sexual violation under slavery would render Black men in the late 20th century as counter-revolutionary. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The clear need that we see demonstrated in Wallace's commentary for a sex and gender politics that would allow the contemporary male homosexual to positively embody the powerful legacy of the sexually violated grandmothers under slavery. As it stands during the time of Wallace's writing and still today, Black men who embody the sexual genealogies of the Black mother and grandmothers still suffer misrecognition and demonization within most arenas of Black radical activity and thought. Trudeer Harris, whom I quoted from earlier, excavates the reality of the Black grandmotherly or mammy-like figures only as a means of demonstrating the Black men's emotionally emasculated relationships to white men, stemming back to slavery. In calling our attention to Luke and Jacobs as prototypical, so this author is saying that these are the prototype, as prototypical historically resonant pairings, I had in mind the implicit gender variant pairings that have informed the logic of Harris, Hooks, Davis, or Spillers, who each in her own way construes gender variance and instability as a negative state to be corrected or transcended. It is because in order to have Black people, you have to make Black people, which requires a Black man and a Black woman. I went on a rant about that in one of my community posts. You can read it there. In her discussion of gender, Spillers describes a transgendered Sapphire switching gender roles with her father. Sapphire enacts her old man in drag, just as her old man becomes Sapphire in outrageous caricature. Hooks pairs the improbable Black male effeminate with masculinized Black women on the plantation. Harris's notion of the Black male mammy parallels Black female powerlessness. It is the masculine connotations implied in the mammy role and Black women in general that lend itself into donning or dragging by Black men under slavery. Then there is Wallace's notion of Black men who enacted the sexual roles of raped maternal figures from slavery. Wallace invokes a parallel structure, the masculinized Black woman from the plantation. In a largely unacknowledged manner, these gender and sexually variant pairings have operated and continue to operate at the nexus of our conceptualization of Black bodies, sexes, gender expressions, and so forth that emerges out of slavery. As a pairing, Luke and Jacobs help us to see the positive outcomes of theorizing gender fluidity. The variance and fluidity of Luke and Jacobs enable them to survive within a culture of human consumption. Luke's role of the male mammy facilitates his resistance to his master and reveals to us in stark fashion the deeper, often unseen dynamics of incest and emotional hunger charging the relation between the master and slave. Although Jacobs provides ambiguous information about his erotic proclivities, we can and should still speculate about the ways in which perhaps Luke's erotic desire for men or for a specific man may have sustained him and made him resistant to his master's desires to erotically partake of and consume him. Likewise with Jacobs in maintaining so vehemently in her narrative, in the narrative of her pursuit of motherhood, we largely overlooked how an aggressive sexuality and masculinized female economy of reproduction defined her relationship to reproduction and her children. Perhaps then, her pursuit of coital pleasure and the children that resulted are better thought of as expressions of her resistance to social consumption. Of course, if we follow this line of thinking, we have to think about Jacob's in all sorts of sexually knowledgeable and therefore unsexed capacities. In addition to her sexuality, there is also the genealogy of Jacob's gender and Black maternity, which I have already explained as rooted in the notion of of male mistresses and masculinized white female appetite and aggression. It is time for us, as forward thinking scholars of slavery, to get beyond our theoretical aversions to gender and sex variance under slavery. I have attempted to clarify through the example of a variant Luke and Jacobs that we still have much labor to do in the way of formally excavating and beginning to analyze the import of gender crossing, sexually fluid pairing. And that is the end of chapter 4. So, as you can see, he is of the mindset that there was some choice, that it was a form of resistance for Luke to succumb to this feminized role of wearing the long shirt and of Jacob's having children. He felt that these were forms of resistance and not just aspects of them being subjected to slavery. What do you think? Do you think this was a form of resistance? I don't know. I think that they were trying to survive their experiences. And in making an attempt to survive their experiences, they did whatever they could do to make sure that their existence on this material plane still mattered. Because the transcendence happens and you're reconnected to all of everything. You don't have any memory of this, right? There is no marriage in heaven. That's what the book say. So I don't know. I think that in all of this, that we need to recognize that people were trying to survive their experiences, because just like today, it was true then. You must survive the encounter, because if you survive the encounter, you live to tell another tale on a different day. I would like to thank Lightbeam 720, KW Don 7, MG2, Redo 9002, The Forecast, Sister Raw, all for being here, and anyone that is still listening whose name I didn't shout out that may not have said anything in the comments. I thank you for continuing to be here with me. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. Kofi from Kofi the Black Critic is listening, and so many others. I value each and every one of you. And remember, surviving the encounter was necessary, right? Because if we don't survive the encounter, we're not there to tell our tales and to pass down information. If we don't survive the encounter, then our story ends and we transcend to another realm. So when you look at these different gender roles that people played in this attempt at this white liberal to tell us that, hey, they had fluid gender identity because they wanted to, that's not true, because they didn't do anything that they wanted to, because if they wanted to, they wouldn't have been enslaved, right? All right. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you on Thursday, where we will be on chapter 5 reading, but it'll be part 6 of our series. All right, guys. Peace.